Travis Boone dropped the receipt on the counter and looked Emily dead in the eyes. Maybe smiling harder will pay your bills. The diner went silent. 23 years old, working double shifts to keep her brother in school, and this was what she got. Not a dollar, not a word of decency, just a folded piece of paper with cruelty written in ballpoint ink. Emily's hands were shaking when she picked it up. She didn't know that 49 motorcycles were already turning onto the highway outside. If this story moves you, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The summer of 2012 arrived in northern Arizona the way it always did, without mercy. The heat came down hard during the day and barely let go at night, and by the time the sun disappeared behind the Kaibab Plateau, the air above the asphalt still shimmered like something was burning underneath. Rust Creek Diner sat at the edge of that heat like it had been forgotten there, a low-slung roadside building with a buzzing neon sign that blinked irregularly and a gravel parking lot that collected more dust than customers after 9 o'clock. Emily Carter had been working the overnight shift at Rust Creek for 11 months. She knew every crack in the linoleum floor. She knew which booth wobbled when you set a coffee pot down too hard. She knew that the jukebox near the window skipped on track 7 and that the ice machine behind the counter made a grinding sound at exactly 2:15 in the morning, reliable as an alarm clock. She knew these things the way a person only knows things they've spent too many long nights paying attention to because there was nothing else to do but pay attention. She was 23 years old. She had kind blue eyes that her mother used to say could convince anyone of anything. And blonde hair she kept pulled back in a practical knot during her shifts because she didn't have time to think about how she looked. She wore the same white uniform she'd worn since the day she started pressed every morning with a hand iron she'd bought at a thrift store because she believed that showing up right was the least you could offer the world when everything else felt like it was slipping. Everything else had been slipping for almost 2 years. Her father, Dennis Carter, had died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October 2010 while driving to his shift at the lumberyard outside town. He was 49 years old and had never missed a day of work in his adult life, and then one Tuesday morning, his heart simply decided it was done. Emily had been 21, her brother Noah had been 17. Their mother, Patricia, had held on for 7 more months. Grief, the doctor said, heart failure technically, but Emily knew the difference between a medical cause and a real one. Their mother had simply not wanted to be here without their father, and eventually her body had agreed. That left Emily and Noah. Noah was brilliant. He was the kind of kid who got quiet when he was thinking hard, who read books without being told to, who asked questions that made adults pause and reconsider things they'd assumed for years. A teacher at his high school had told Emily once that Noah was the kind of student who came along once in a decade, that if he had the chance he could go somewhere, could do something that mattered. Emily had held on to those words. She had written them on a piece of paper and tucked it into the small frame with her parents' photograph on her nightstand. Because on the nights when she couldn't sleep and the loneliness pressed down on her chest like a physical weight, she needed to be reminded why she was doing what she was doing. Noah had been accepted to Coconino Community College in Flagstaff. Tuition, books, a shared apartment close enough to campus that he didn't need a car. These things cost money. They cost a specific kind of money, not the kind that came all at once, but the kind that needed to be there every month, reliable and real, or the whole arrangement fell apart. Emily's wages at Rust Creek covered the basics. The tips were what kept Noah's tuition paid. Every dollar she made in tips went into a white envelope she kept in the back of her kitchen drawer. She labeled it with a single word in marker Noah. At the end of each week, she counted what was in it. Some weeks it was enough. Some weeks she had to decide what didn't get paid that month, so the envelope stayed full. She had never told Noah any of this. She didn't want him to know the weight she was carrying because she was afraid that if he knew he'd offer to drop out and get a job instead, and she couldn't allow that. She would carry the weight. It was fine. She was 23 and strong, and the nights at Rust Creek were long, but they weren't forever, and she told herself that on a regular basis because she needed it to be true. It was a Friday night in late July when Travis Boone and Kyle Mercer walked through the front door of Rust Creek Diner at 9:47 in the evening. Emily heard the bell above the door and looked up from the coffee station where she was refilling a carafe. She recognized them immediately. Most people in a 30-mile radius recognized Travis Boone and Kyle Mercer, not because they were famous or powerful in any meaningful sense, but because they were the kind of men whose presence made ordinary people shift uncomfortably in their seats and find reasons to look somewhere else. Travis was 34, stocky, with thick forearms and a jaw that always seemed clenched even when he wasn't angry. He worked for a private lending company out of Flagstaff that operated in the gray zone between legal and predatory, the kind of operation that gave loans to desperate people at rates they couldn't sustain, and then sent men like Travis to collect when those people inevitably fell behind. Kyle Mercer was his partner in this work, leaner, quieter, with pale eyes that moved around a room the way a camera pans taking inventory. Neither of them was a criminal in the prosecutable sense. They had never technically broken any law that had been successfully used against them. But the people who dealt with them came away feeling like something had been taken from them that they couldn't quite name, and that feeling was by design. Travis and Kyle were professionals at making people feel small and outnumbered, at pressing on the places where ordinary life made ordinary people vulnerable, and they were good at their work because they enjoyed it. Emily had seen them in the diner once before 6 months ago. They had sat in her section, run up a $12 tab, and left without a tip. She remembered it because she had stood at the table after they left and felt that specific variety of exhausted she only felt when she'd been working hard for someone who didn't consider her worth acknowledging. She'd cleared their plates and moved on. That was the job. Tonight felt different the moment they sat down. They took the large corner booth, the one that could seat 6, and spread out across it. Travis on one side, Kyle on the other, both of them taking up more space than they needed in the deliberate way of men who want to make clear that space is theirs to take. Emily gave it a moment, finished pouring coffee for the couple at table 4, and walked over with her notepad. "Evening," she said. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" Travis looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Not the way someone looks at you when they're thinking about what they want. The way someone looks at you when they want you to know they're deciding whether you're worth looking at. "Coffee," he said finally, "and make sure it's hot. Last time it was cold." Emily had no memory of serving him coffee the last time, but she nodded. "Absolutely. And for you." She looked at Kyle. Kyle was studying the menu with the focused indifference of someone who had already decided how the evening was going to go. "Same," he said without looking up. She brought the coffee. Both cups were steaming. She had poured them fresh from a new carafe she'd just brewed. She set them down carefully and asked if they were ready to order. Travis picked up his cup, took a sip, and set it back down with a soft, deliberate clunk. "This is lukewarm," he said. Emily paused. She had poured that coffee 90 seconds ago from a carafe she'd brewed 4 minutes before that. She knew what lukewarm coffee tasted like. That was not lukewarm coffee. "I'm sorry," she said evenly. "I can get you a fresh cup right away." That was a fresh cup, Travis said, and there was something in his voice now, a patience that wasn't really patience, the stillness of someone who has decided they're going to enjoy taking their time with this. "I'm just saying it's not what I asked for." She brought fresh coffee. She poured it from a separate pot she'd pulled directly off the burner. She set it down in front of him without a word. He wrapped both hands around the mug, waited, and then said, "Better." She took their orders. Travis wanted a burger medium rare with onion rings instead of fries, and he wanted the onions thin cut, not thick. Kyle wanted a patty melt on sourdough, no mayo, extra pickles, and he wanted the bread toasted darker than they usually did it. She wrote everything down exactly as they said it and walked to the service window to put the order in. Mac, the cook, looked at the ticket. "Thin-cut onion rings," he said. "I know," Emily said. "We only have one kind of onion rings." "I know that too." Mac shrugged and started the order. She checked on her other tables, the couple at 4, a pair of truckers at the counter, an older man sitting alone near the window with a newspaper and a slice of pie. The diner was quiet the way it usually was on Friday nights. After 9, the highway crowd mostly passed through, and the next wave still a few hours away. She topped off coffee at the counter and circled back to check on table 4, and when she came back past the corner booth to see if Travis and Kyle needed anything, Travis was holding up his coffee cup. "Getting cold again," he said. She poured more coffee. The cup was still more than half full, which meant he'd barely touched it since she'd refilled it 3 minutes ago. She poured without comment. "You know what your problem is," Travis said while she poured. Emily kept her expression neutral. "I'll grab fresh creamer for you," she said. "I'm being serious," Travis said, leaning back in the booth and crossing his arms across his chest, the posture of a man who has decided he has something valuable to impart. You've got a resting face. You look unhappy. Customers don't like that. Kyle glanced up from his phone and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Emily set the coffee pot on the edge of the table. She looked at Travis. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to make clear she had heard him and chosen her response carefully. "Is there anything else I can get you right now?" she said. Travis smiled. "Not right now," he said, "but we'll let you know." The order came up 11 minutes later. She carried both plates to the booth and set them down. Travis looked at the burger, then at the onion rings, then back up at her. "These aren't thin cut," he said. "That's how we cut our onion rings," Emily said. "I should have been clearer when I took the order. I apologize for any confusion. I asked for thin cut." "I understand. We do have one style of onion ring. If you'd like something else." "I'd like thin cut onion rings," Travis said, "like I asked for." She took the plate back. Mac was already looking at her when she came through to the kitchen. "He's sending them back." "Just the onion rings," she said. "I told you, Vaughn. Can you make them thinner?" Mac gave her a look that said he knew exactly what was happening at that table, and he felt bad about it, and he also wasn't going to get involved. He took the basket of onion rings, ran them through the slicer a second time until they were closer to what could generously be called thin, and put them back in the fryer. She brought them back. Travis examined one bit into it and nodded slowly. "That's closer," he said in the tone of a teacher grading an assignment that didn't quite make the mark. Kyle's patty melt, it turned out, was too dark on the bread. He mentioned this without looking up from his phone. She offered to have a new one made. He said don't bother, he'd eat it, but it came through in the tone of a man doing her a significant favor. The couple at table 4 left. The older man near the window finished his pie and asked for his check. She ran in his check, brought change, cleared the table, wiped it down, reset it. The truckers at the counter ordered a second round of coffee and pie. She kept moving because that was what you did. You kept moving, you stayed busy, you didn't let anyone's table take up more room in your head than it had earned. But Travis and Kyle were earning more room by the minute. At 10:45, she brought their check. Travis looked at it, then looked up at her, then looked back down at it in the exaggerated way of a man doing math he found suspicious. "Seems high," he said. She walked him through the items on the check. Everything was correct. The prices were on the menu. He watched her go through it with an expression of patient skepticism, as if he expected her to find an error she had hidden there deliberately. "Fine," he said eventually. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He counted out bills with the slow, deliberate care of a man who wants you to watch him do it, who wants the process of him paying you to be an event rather than a transaction. He set the money on the table, the exact amount to the dollar, with no remainder. And then he picked up the pen she'd left with the check holder, and he wrote something on the receipt. He set it down, capped the pen, and stood up. Kyle stood too. They put on their jackets with the unhurried movement of men who believe they've just done something worth remembering. Travis looked at Emily one more time. "Thanks for dinner," he said. And the way he said it, flat final, with the smallest smile at the edge of his mouth, made it clear the words meant the opposite of what words like that were supposed to mean. They walked out. The bell above the door rang. Emily stood at the table for a moment. Then she picked up the check holder. She looked at the receipt. "Maybe smiling harder will pay your bills." She read it once. Then she read it again because the first time she thought she might have misread it, and she wanted to be sure before she decided what she was feeling about it. She had not misread it. She stood there holding that receipt in the middle of a quiet diner at 10:47 on a Friday night in July, 23 years old, with a brother in college, and a white envelope in her kitchen drawer, and 3 tables to reset before the next rush. And she felt something crack open somewhere in the middle of her chest. Not from sadness. Not exactly. It was something older and more complicated than sadness. It was the specific pain of a person who has been working hard in good faith and has been told plainly that their good faith doesn't matter, that their effort is invisible, that the only thing another person can find to say about them is a small, mean joke about money they don't have. She walked to the kitchen. The door swung shut behind her. Mac was scrubbing the grill. He looked up when she came in. He didn't say anything because she wasn't talking, and Mac was the kind of man who understood that sometimes people needed to be in a kitchen for a minute without anyone asking them anything. She stood at the stainless steel prep counter and pressed both palms flat on the cold surface. She stared at the wall. She breathed. One breath, then another. She was not going to cry. She made that decision deliberately the way she made most decisions, quietly without drama, because there was no one around to perform anything for, and because crying in a commercial kitchen at 10:48 on a Friday night would solve exactly nothing. Behind her, she heard Max set down his scrubbing pad. She heard him clear his throat. "You okay?" he said. "Fine," she said. He didn't push it. She was grateful for that. She went back out. She cleared the corner booth. She wiped it down. She reset it with clean silverware and a fresh set of napkins and new salt and pepper shakers, because whoever sat there next deserved a clean start, even if the night had felt like anything but. She slipped the receipt into the pocket of her apron. She didn't know why. She just didn't want to throw it away yet. It felt important to keep it nearby for a little while. The way you sometimes keep a painful thing close because discarding it too quickly feels like giving it permission to have never happened. The diner settled back into its quiet. The truckers at the counter were talking about road conditions heading south. The kitchen was still. Outside, the highway was empty under the sodium lights, nothing moving in either direction as far as she could see. She stood behind the counter and refilled the napkin dispensers. One by one, mine. She lined them up. She made them straight. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, the other pocket, not the one with the receipt. She pulled it out. A text from Noah. "Hey, check the email. Financial aid letter came in. Call me when you get a chance. It's not bad news, but we should talk." She stared at the message for a moment. She typed back, "On shift till 6. Everything okay?" His reply came 30 seconds later. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just want to talk through some stuff." "No rush." She put the phone back. "No rush." That was what people said when there was in fact some kind of rush, but they were trying to protect you from knowing about it until the timing was better. She thought about the white envelope in her kitchen drawer. She thought about how much was in it. She thought about tuition deadlines, and she thought about the months ahead, and she thought about her parents who had believed that working hard and being decent were their own reward, that the universe had a kind of reciprocity built into it if you just kept showing up the right way. She wondered, standing there with a stack of folded napkins in her hands, if they had been right about that. She really genuinely wondered. The bell above the door rang. A man walked in she didn't recognize, late 40s, thick-billed flannel shirt. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs. She poured the coffee and called the order back to Mac and refilled the truckers without being asked, and the diner found its rhythm again. She worked. That was what she did. That was what she had always done. She moved through the space with the practiced efficiency of a person who has made peace with the fact that the work matters, even when no one tells you it does, who has decided that the care she puts into things is the only standard she can control. But the receipt was still in her pocket, and every time she moved, she felt it there, light as paper, heavy as everything else. At 11:30, the couple from table 4 came back in. They'd forgotten the wife's reading glasses on the seat. Emily had found them when she cleared the table and set them behind the counter. She handed them over. The woman thanked her 3 times and pressed a folded $5 bill into Emily's hand before her husband could stop her, saying that she never tipped enough when they were here, and tonight she meant to make it right. Emily tried to refuse it. The woman wouldn't hear of it. "Honey," the woman said, squeezing Emily's hand around the bill. "You deserve better than whatever is making your eyes look like that." Emily didn't have an answer for that. She just nodded and said thank you and watched them leave, and she stood there by the door for a moment after the bell stopped ringing, holding $5 in her palm that felt like it weighed something far greater than $5. She put it in the Noah envelope in her mind, added it to the running total she kept there. The diner settled again. At 11:52, the truckers left. At 12:15, the man with the eggs paid his check and went out to the lot where his rig was parked. Emily was alone in the dining room, Mac in the kitchen, Karen, the other overnight waitress, still on her break in the back, when she heard something from outside. A sound, low and far away, and rhythmic like the beginning of something rather than the middle or the end. A hum that the highway sometimes carried when weather was moving through, except the night was still and clear, and there was no weather moving through. She stood behind the counter and tipped her head slightly and listened. The sound was getting closer. It wasn't thunder, it was engines. She looked through the window at the highway beyond the parking lot. The road was dark. And then it wasn't because something was coming from the east, something low and fast, and multiplied a long chain of lights moving in tight formation like a river that had decided to travel down a road instead of a valley. Motorcycles. more than she'd ever seen moving together at once. She counted the headlights as they turned off the highway into the gravel lot one after another, and she lost count somewhere past 30 and started again, and by the time the last one had turned in and the engines were dropping to idle, she had counted 49. She stood at the window. 49 motorcycles in the parking lot of Rust Creek Diner on a Friday night at 12:17 in the morning. The engines cut one by one, going quiet from the front of the pack to the back, like a line of candles being extinguished, until the only sound was the crunch of boots on gravel and the tick of cooling metal. In the kitchen, Max said, "Emily." His voice had a question in it she hadn't heard from him before. "I see them," she said. She reached up and straightened the front of her uniform. She tucked a loose strand of hair back behind her ear. She squared her shoulders, picked up a stack of menus, and walked to the door. Because they were customers. And whatever else was true about this night, however it had gone, however the receipt in her pocket had made her feel she still had a job to do, she was still Emily Carter. And Emily Carter did not turn customers away at the door because she was tired or hurt or afraid. She pushed the door open and stepped out to meet them. The first thing she noticed was how quiet they were for a group that size. 49 people getting off motorcycles in a parking lot should have sounded like a controlled chaos of voices and laughter and the normal noise of people arriving somewhere. Instead, they moved with a calm that felt purposeful, organized without being military, steady without being tense, like a group that had been together long enough to not need to announce itself. The second thing she noticed was the vests. Black leather, and on the back the patch, the winged skull emblem, the red and white lettering. HELLS Angels. She knew the name. Everybody knew the name. But knowing a name and standing in a gravel parking lot at midnight, watching 49 of them dismount in front of you, were two very different kinds of knowing. A man walked toward her from the front of the pack. He was somewhere around 50. She thought hard to say exactly because some people wore their years the way a landscape wears weather, in ways that added character rather than subtracting it. He was broad through the chest and shoulders, with a close-trimmed gray beard and gray hair slicked back from a face that had seen a significant amount of living. He moved with the deliberate ease of a man who had not been in a hurry for a long time and had arrived at a settled peace with that fact. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at the door. He looked at her. "Evening," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to carry. "We've been on the road since Albuquerque. Any chance you've got room for us?" Emily held the stack of menus against her chest. She looked past him at the 48 riders who were waiting in the parking lot with a patience that, now that she was this close to it, felt almost startling. She looked back at him. "We've got room," she said. "Come on in." She held the door open and they came in. Not all at once, that would have been chaos, and these men did not do chaos. They filed in with a discipline that reminded Emily of something she couldn't immediately name. And then she placed it. It was the way her father used to say the men he respected most always moved. Like they had somewhere to be, and they planned to get there without making a scene about it. One by one, then two by two, filling the booths along the walls first, then the counter stools, then the tables in the middle, spreading through the dining room, the way water fills a space completely without forcing anything. The man who had spoken to her in the parking lot was the last one through the door. He waited until every one of his riders was inside before he stepped in himself, and he stood for a moment just past the threshold and looked around the room the way a person looks at something they're taking responsibility for. Then he found an empty stool at the end of the counter nearest the door and sat down. Emily stood in the middle of the dining room with 49 menus in her arms and understood with a clarity that surprised her that the next few hours were going to require everything she had. "Karen," she called toward the back, and her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. Karen appeared from the hallway that led to the break room, and she stopped when she saw the dining room. She was 41 and had been working at Rust Creek for 9 years, and Emily had never seen her look surprised by anything. Right now, she looked surprised. "How many?" Karen said quietly. 49, Emily said. Karen took that in. She straightened her apron. "Okay," she said. "I'll take the left side." "Thank you." They moved. That was the only option. You moved. You worked. You didn't stand in the middle of the floor calculating the odds. Emily started with the counter, working from left to right, setting down menus and asking for drink orders and being exactly what she always was at this job present: efficient, unfussy. She did not make it a production. She did not treat them like a spectacle or a threat or a news event. They were customers. She brought them coffee. The man at the end of the counter, the one who had spoken to her outside, was watching her when she got to him. Not in the way Travis Boone had watched her, which had been the watching of a man taking inventory of weaknesses. This was quieter, more considered, the way someone watches something they're trying to understand before they say anything about it. Coffee, she said. Please, he said. Black. She poured it. He wrapped both hands around the mug, the way people do when they've been cold for a long time, even when the night is warm, because the road has a way of pulling the heat out of you, no matter what the thermometer says. Ray Dawson, he said. She wasn't sure if that was an introduction or a statement of fact. Emily Carter, she said. I'll be with you in a few minutes to take your order. He nodded once. She moved on. The dining room had come alive in a way she hadn't expected. These 49 men filled the space differently than a normal crowd. There were conversations happening, quiet ones, the specific low murmur of people who have spent long hours together and have moved past the need to fill every silence. Some of them were looking at menus. A few were on their phones. Two men in the back booth were playing some kind of card game on the table between them, small stakes, shuffling fast. A guy at the counter 3 seats from Ray was talking to the man next to him about tire pressure, specifically with the focused sincerity of someone for whom tire pressure is a matter of genuine philosophical interest. They were, Emily thought, as she moved through them, taking orders, just people. Loud at the edges maybe, but people. The kind you served coffee to and asked whether they wanted their eggs scrambled or over easy. She was at the service window, calling back a string of orders to Mac, and Mac's face had taken on the expression of a man who has just been handed a problem that is interesting and stressful in equal measure when she heard the door. The bell above it rang. She turned, expecting another rider who'd been late parking. But it wasn't a rider, it was Travis Boone. He pushed the door open and stepped back into Rust Creek Diner at 12:31 in the morning, with the casual ownership of a man returning to a place where he had unfinished business. Kyle Mercer was right behind him. Travis got halfway across the threshold and stopped when he saw the room. 49 unfamiliar faces, the leather, the patches, and something moved across his face that he covered almost immediately. Almost. Kyle had stopped dead in the doorway. Emily watched Travis do a rapid recalculation. She could see it happening, the quick scan of the room, the reassessment of the situation, the decision about whether to advance or retreat. He chose to advance. He walked to the counter with the performance of a man who had decided to be unbothered, which is not the same thing as being unbothered. He sat down 2 stools from Ray Dawson. Kyle sat beside him. Emily crossed the dining room to where they were sitting. She stopped in front of them and looked at Travis and said with the professional even-handedness she had spent 11 months perfecting. Back again. Travis looked around the room once more with casual eyes. Just forgot something, he said. What did you forget? The question caught him. She could see it catch him. He hadn't expected her to push on it, and he had to improvise. We were talking about coming back for dessert, he said. Didn't we say that Kyle said, yeah, in the tone of a man who will agree with whatever Travis says, because that is the nature of their arrangement. Emily looked at Travis for one deliberate moment. Then she picked up her notepad. What can I get you? Pie, Travis said. Whatever you've got. She wrote it down. She went back to the service window and called it in, and she stood at the window for a moment with her back to the room and thought about what she knew to be true. Travis Boone had not come back for pie. Travis Boone had left that diner 2 hours ago feeling good about himself, about the receipt he'd written, about the dollar he hadn't left, about the particular shape of cruelty he delivered with such precision. He had come back because he wanted to see her again, because he wasn't done yet. The understanding of that landed in her stomach like something cold. Mac appeared at the service window. He glanced past her into the dining room. That them, he said quietly. She knew who he meant. Yeah. You want me to come out there? No, she said. It's fine. Emily. It's fine, Mac. She picked up 2 coffee pots, 1 regular, 1 decaf, and went back to work. Ray Dawson had his coffee mug halfway to his mouth when she refilled it. He set it back down and watched her move to the next stool. He didn't say anything, but she noticed when she came back along the counter that his attention had shifted slightly away from his coffee toward the 2 men who had sat down at the other end. Travis had found his voice again by now. He was talking to Kyle not loudly, but in that particular register that men use when they want to be heard by someone nearby without appearing to address them directly. Emily was 3 stools away when she heard him say, "Service here is real slow." You'd think with 40 people in the place, they could have hired someone who knows what they're doing. Kyle made the noise that served as his laugh. Emily topped off a mug and moved to the next stool. "Of course, some people aren't really cut out for this work," Travis continued. Same register, same calibrated carrying distance. Some people it shows. Emily reached the stool directly between Travis and Ray and refilled the mug there. The rider sitting on that stool, a big man with forearms like dock rope and a red bandana folded neatly above his brow, had gone very still. He was looking into his coffee mug with the focused attention of a man who was choosing carefully not to look somewhere else. Emily moved on. She went to the back half of the dining room, checking in on the booths along the wall, taking orders she hadn't gotten to yet, keeping her section running. She was good at this, at keeping a large room moving, at tracking where things were and what needed to happen next. She had learned it the hard way through 11 months of shifts that had asked more of her than she'd originally thought she had. But she had always had enough. She always found it. What she was trying to find right now, moving between the booths with her notepad, was a version of equanimity that felt real rather than performed. Because what Travis was doing, the low-register commentary, the just loud enough observations, the returning, was working on her. She could feel it working. Her jaw was tight. Her handwriting on the order tickets was slightly smaller than usual, which happened when she was compressing herself, trying to take up less space, and she hated that she was doing it. She hated that he could come back into a room she'd been working in all night and make her smaller just by being in it. She carried 4 plates from the service window to a booth in the back and set them down and asked if everything looked right, and a man with a scar along his jaw and quiet eyes told her, "The eggs look perfect." "Thank you," and she smiled and meant it, because you could mean it for some people even while other people in the same room were making it hard to mean anything. At the counter, Travis had ordered a second coffee. Karen had poured it. Emily watched Karen's face when she came back behind the counter. Karen, who had a daughter in middle school and an ex-husband who had left her with both car payments, who had been working Rust Creek long enough to have seen most things and developed a working policy of saying nothing about any of them. Karen's face right now said, "I see what this is and I don't like it, and I am not going to be the one who does something about it." Emily knew that face because she had made that face herself more than once. It was a face born from a specific kind of workplace calculus, the math of deciding how much something is worth the cost of addressing it and concluding reluctantly that the cost is too high. She went to the register to run a check for a table that was leaving 2 riders, who left a 20 on a $14 bill and told her to keep it without making it a production, just stated it plainly and walked to the door, and she thanked them and meant that too. At 1:15 in the morning, Travis Boone did something new. He was still at the counter. He'd had 2 coffees and the pie she had brought him, the pie herself, a slice of peach that Mac had put together with more care than it deserved, because Mac believed the food was always innocent, even when the customer wasn't. Travis had eaten half of it and was leaving the rest. And he called her over now with a gesture that was technically just raising 2 fingers, but managed to contain the full weight of a man who believes he's calling for service in the only direction service can travel. She went. "This pie's dry," he said. She looked at the plate. "I can get you another slice." "That's not the point," he said. He leaned back on the stool and looked at her with that specific patience again, the patience that was really the opposite of patience. "The point is, I ordered something and it wasn't right. That's on the kitchen maybe, but it's also on the server." He paused. "That's you." "I understand," Emily said. "Do you—" "Because you don't seem bothered." She held his gaze. "Can I get you anything else tonight?" "Yeah," he said, a better attitude. It was quiet enough at that end of the counter that she heard the sound, a very soft sound, barely a sound at all, more like the absence of movement that follows a sudden small decision. She looked down the counter. Ray Dawson had set down his coffee mug. He was looking at Travis now. Not with anger, she registered that first, because anger was what she might have expected, and it wasn't anger. It was something more patient than anger and more dangerous than patience. He was looking at Travis the way a man looks at a math problem he's been working on for a while and has just arrived at the answer to. Travis felt it. She could see him feel it, a slight shift in his posture, a recalibration, the way you adjust when you notice the temperature in a room has changed and you're not sure what changed it. He looked down at his pie. Ray looked back at his coffee. Emily said quietly, I'll take that plate if you're done with it. She took the plate. She went to the kitchen. She stood at the prep counter and pressed her palms flat on the cold steel the same way she had 2 hours ago after Travis had first walked out. Her heart was beating faster than she would have liked it to. That was the honest truth of it. She could perform calm. She was very good at performing calm, but her heart was doing what it wanted underneath the performance. And what it wanted was to beat faster because her body was tracking something her professional manner was declining to acknowledge. She was afraid, not of being physically hurt, that wasn't the shape of it. She was afraid of what it meant that this man kept coming back, that he'd left and returned and was still going, still finding new angles, still pressing on her in the presence of a room full of people who were pretending they weren't watching. She was afraid of what it said about the specific vulnerability she carried. Being young, being a woman, being alone in this job, in the way that people in service jobs were always alone, standing between the customer and the kitchen with no one formally on her side. She breathed. She straightened up. She went back out. Ray Dawson was watching her from the moment she came through the kitchen door. He didn't look away when she caught him looking. He just waited, and when she came around to his end of the counter to see if he needed a refill, he said in a low voice that didn't carry, "You doing all right?" She poured his coffee. "Of course," she said. He watched her for another moment. "Okay," he said. He nodded once and looked back down at his mug, and she moved on. At 1:32, Karen came to Emily at the service window and said very quietly, not meeting her eyes, "Those two at the counter, do you know them?" "Yeah," Emily said. "They were in earlier." Karen looked at her then. "I know. Should I get Steve?" Steve was the manager. He arrived at 6 a.m., which was 4.5 hours from now. The name of the overnight manager technically was Gary Pittman, who was currently asleep in his truck in the parking lot because he worked a second job during the day and had decided approximately 4 months ago that the overnight at Rust Creek ran itself fine and he was going to sleep through it. "Gary's in the lot," Emily said. "I know Gary's in the lot," Karen said. "Gary is useless, which is a different thing than not being here." Emily almost smiled at that. "I'm fine," she said. "You keep saying that because it keeps being true." Karen looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has been in enough difficult rooms to know the difference between someone who is fine and someone who has decided to be fine regardless. Then she picked up a coffee pot and went back to work because that was the only other option. Travis ordered a third coffee. He didn't need a third coffee. He was not there for coffee. He was there because he had decided somewhere in the construction of this evening that leaving when he wanted to leave was not as interesting as leaving when he had finished whatever this was. And whatever this was had not yet reached its natural conclusion, at least not by his measure. He was talking again. Still the same register directed at Kyle, audible to the surrounding area. He was talking about work ethic, about how people in service jobs sometimes confuse showing up with being good at something, and how a bad attitude was a business liability, and how customers could tell when someone didn't actually want to be there. He said this with the thoughtful authority of a man who had given the matter serious professional consideration. The rider with the bandana 3 stools down had stopped eating. Another rider at the first booth, a younger man, maybe 30, with a shaved head and a careful face, had put down his fork and was looking at the back of Travis's head with an expression that Emily couldn't quite classify, but that made her instinctively want to move toward the center of the room. She went instead to the booth of a group of 4 who were signaling for their check and ran their tab and took the payment and thanked them. And when she turned back, she saw that Ray Dawson had shifted on his stool. He'd moved 45 degrees, not dramatically, not all at once, but he was no longer facing the counter. He was angled slightly toward the room, toward where Travis and Kyle were sitting, in the way that a man who has been sitting quietly and doing his own business and minding his own thoughts will angle when something in the surrounding environment has asked for a small but specific kind of attention. His eyes found Travis's profile. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Travis felt it again. Emily could see the feeling travel through him, that prickling awareness of being watched by something that has decided to watch you, something that has the patience for it. He took a sip of his coffee. He said something else to Kyle, something she didn't catch, and Kyle's response was shorter this time, less committed. At 1:51, a rider Emily hadn't spoken to directly, a heavy-set man in his late 40s with silver-framed glasses and a gentleness to his face that surprised her every time she looked at it, got up from his booth and walked to the counter. He sat down on the stool that was empty on the other side of Travis. Not close, not crowding, just present. Travis looked at him. The man with the silver glasses ordered a piece of pie from Karen in a perfectly normal voice and began eating it in perfectly normal silence. Travis looked back at his coffee. At 2 o'clock, a third rider got up from a table in the back and came to the counter. Not sitting, just standing behind one of the empty stools, talking to the man already sitting there about something to do with a route through New Mexico. They weren't being loud. They weren't doing anything aggressive or even intentional as far as Emily could tell. They were just there. Additional people who had decided to be near the counter at this particular time for ordinary reasons. The dining room was redistributing, subtly without announcement. The center of gravity was shifting. Kyle leaned toward Travis and said something in his ear. Travis's jaw tightened. He said something back without moving his mouth much. Kyle sat back. Emily was behind the counter now, running credit cards and making change, keeping her eyes on what needed to be done. But she was very aware that the room had changed in the last 15 minutes. Not in any way she could point to directly. Nothing had happened. No one had said anything specific. But something had reorganized itself the way things reorganize before a particular kind of weather arrives. She reached into her apron pocket for a pen. Her fingers found the receipt instead. She pulled it out without meaning to. It was still folded the way she'd folded it when she'd put it in there, and she looked at it in her hand for a moment before she registered what she was doing. She put it back, reached into the other pocket, found the pen. But Ray Dawson had been watching the counter, and she couldn't be sure. She didn't think he'd seen what she'd pulled out and looked at, but she couldn't be certain. When she looked up, he was looking at his coffee again. At 2:17, Travis stood up. She thought for a moment that he was leaving. Something in her chest loosened at the prospect, the involuntary physical relief of a problem deciding to walk out the door on its own. But Travis didn't move toward the exit. He stood up and stretched, the slow, deliberate stretch of a man making himself visible, and then he turned and looked directly at Emily across the counter and said with the ease of someone who has decided they have run out of patience for subtlety, "Can I ask you something?" She looked at him. "Sure." "Is the manager here tonight?" She held herself very still. "Is there a problem with your order?" "No problem," he said. "Just wondering if there's someone in charge I could give some feedback to." The dining room was quieter than it had been. She hadn't noticed it happening, but the level of conversation had dropped in the last 30 seconds. Not gone, not silence, but reduced the way sound reduces when people are making a choice to be quieter so they can hear something specific. "I can pass along any feedback," Emily said. "I'd rather talk to someone with authority to act on it," Travis said. He was doing the reasonable voice now, the one that made everything he said sound like a perfectly legitimate grievance, being raised through appropriate channels, the voice that was very effective because it was very difficult to object to. "The manager is unavailable at this hour," she said. "I'm happy to pass along whatever you want to share." "Unavailable," Travis repeated like the word was interesting to him. "What does that mean, unavailable?" "It means I can pass along whatever you want to share," she said again. Steady, even. She was holding herself together the way you hold a cracked thing together carefully with specific pressure, not moving any part of it you don't have to. Travis looked at her for a moment. Then he looked around the room, a slow, deliberate survey, the kind that was meant to be seen and said at a volume that was no longer contained to the counter, that carried now into the middle of the dining room. "I just want to make sure whoever's responsible for the service here tonight knows that some people in the service industry forget that the customer is actually the whole point." Silence. Not complete silence. The road outside had a sound. The kitchen had a sound. But the dining room fell into something that was as close to silence as 49 people in one room could produce. And into that silence, Ray Dawson turned on his stool. He turned all the way around. He faced Travis Boone full on for the first time all night. And he said in a voice that was so calm it was almost gentle, "Hey." Travis looked at him. "How long you been here tonight?" Ray said. Travis studied him. "Came in earlier," he said carefully. "Came back for dessert." Ray looked at the counter, then he looked back up. "Both times in her section." A pause. "Yeah," Travis said. "And you got everything you ordered both times." Another pause shorter. "More or less." Ray nodded slowly. He looked down the counter at Emily. He looked back at Travis. He said, "So what exactly is the complaint?" Travis opened his mouth and closed it. For the first time since he had walked into Rust Creek Diner, Travis Boone did not have an immediate answer ready. Ray waited. The room waited. Emily stood behind the counter and held herself together and breathed, and she felt something shift in the balance of the space, some small but significant thing, and she wasn't sure yet what it was going to become, but she felt it shift and she held on. Travis found his words again. He always found his words. "I'm just saying," he said more quietly now, "that attitude matters in this business." "Sure does," Ray said. He picked up his coffee mug. "Hers seems fine to me." He took a sip, he set the mug down, he turned back to the counter, and the room very slowly began to breathe again. But Travis was still standing, and Emily knew, looking at the set of his shoulders, the way his hands were at his sides, the particular stillness of a man who has just been publicly checked in a room full of strangers and is deciding what to do with that he was not done. He had not walked back in here to be done. He had walked back in here because something in him required a specific kind of ending, and so far, the night had refused to give it to him. She was right. He looked at her. Past Ray, past the men on the counter, stools directly at her. And he said, "I left something before, a note on the receipt. You find that?" She didn't answer right away. "Emily," he said, and the use of her name, her actual name, not something he should have known, something he must have read off the name tag she wore pinned to the left side of her uniform, sent a cold wire through her chest. "I found it," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. "Just wanted to make sure the message got through." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. Those had been reactive, the room going quiet in response to something that had just happened. This one was the silence before, the kind that lives in the moment between when the thing is said and when everything changes because of it. Ray Dawson set down his coffee mug. Not hard. He didn't slam it. He placed it with the quiet precision of someone making a decision, the sound of ceramic on formica in a room that was ready to hear everything. He turned on his stool again. He looked at Emily. His voice was the same calm it had always been, but underneath it now there was something that had been there all along waiting to become visible. "What did the note say?" he asked her. She looked at him. She looked at the receipt she could feel through the fabric of her apron pocket light, as paper heavy as the whole long night. "It doesn't matter," she said. "Emily," he said, and the way he said her name was nothing like the way Travis had said it. "What did the note say?" She reached into her pocket. She unfolded the receipt. She set it on the counter in front of Ray Dawson. He looked at it for a long time. He didn't pick it up. He just read it where it lay flat on the counter under the fluorescent light. "Maybe smiling harder will pay your bills." He read it once. He raised his eyes to Travis Boone, and the room went very, very still. Ray Dawson did not raise his voice. That was the first thing Travis Boone had not accounted for. He had a working model of how confrontations went, how they escalated, how volume built on volume, how you matched energy with energy and came out ahead if yours was bigger. He had practiced that model many times over many years, and it had served him well because most people, when they push back loud. Loud was manageable. Loud had a shape you could work with. Ray didn't give him loud. Ray sat on his stool with both hands around his coffee mug and looked at Travis with the specific patience of a man who has seen more versions of this moment than he could count and has long since stopped finding any of them surprising. He looked at him for what felt in the silence of the dining room like a very long time. Then he said quietly, "Come here." It wasn't a request. It wasn't an order either exactly. It was something that occupied the space between those two things, the kind of thing you say when you know that the person you're saying it to is going to do it. And you know it not because you're threatening them, but because you're right and they know it too. And somewhere underneath all the performance they've been doing all night is a part of them that has been waiting for someone to say exactly this. Travis came. He walked down the counter with his hands loose at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man who is cooperating voluntarily, who wants to make clear that this is his choice, that he is not being moved by anything external. He stopped in front of Ray and looked at the receipt lying on the counter between them. Ray looked at it too. Then he looked up. "Pick it up," Ray said. Travis looked at the receipt. He looked at Ray. He picked it up. "Read it," Ray said. "I know what it says," Travis said. "I wrote it." "Then reading it again should be easy," Ray said. Travis's jaw tightened. He looked at the paper in his hand. He read it. His lips barely moved. Out loud, Ray said. The dining room was so quiet now that the sound of the highway outside a single truck passing far off was clearly audible. Karen had stopped moving. Mac had appeared in the service window, both arms on the ledge, and was watching with the concentrated stillness of a man who has placed a bet and is waiting to see how the cards fall. Travis's face had gone through several changes in the last 30 seconds. The performance of easiness was gone. What was underneath it was harder to read. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something in between that looked like a man discovering in real time that the ground he'd been standing on was different than he'd assessed. Maybe smiling harder will pay your bills, Travis said. His voice was flat. The words sounded coming out of his mouth in a room full of people waiting to hear them different than they had sounded in his head when he'd written them. He seemed to register that. A muscle in his jaw moved. Ray nodded. He took the receipt back. He held it between two fingers and looked at it the way you look at something that tells you everything you need to know about a person in a very small amount of space. She served you tonight, Ray said. Both times you came in. That right? Yeah, Travis said. She gets your order right. Pause. More or less. More or less, Ray repeated. He set the receipt on the counter. He looked at Emily, who was standing at the end of the counter, not because she had decided to stand there, but because she had stopped moving when Ray had said, "Come here," and hadn't started again. She gets your order right? Ray asked her. I got his orders right, Emily said. Ray looked back at Travis. So she did her job. She did it all night, including coming back when you came back. And at the end of it, you wrote this. Travis said nothing. Why, Ray said. One word. No elaboration. No performance around it. Just the questions sitting there in the open air of the diner at 2:21 in the morning, waiting to be answered. Travis looked at the receipt. He looked at Ray. He looked at the room, and that was when Emily saw it, the precise moment when Travis Boone understood the full geometry of where he was standing. Not the counter, not the diner, not even the specific number of people in the room. The geometry of it, the weight distribution. The thing that Ray Dawson hadn't had to arrange or announce or threaten into being, that had simply assembled itself in the course of a long night. 49 men who were not looking away. They weren't standing. They weren't crowding in. Nobody had moved in a way that could be characterized as aggressive or even deliberate. They were sitting in their booths and at their tables and on their counter stools in exactly the positions they'd been in for the last hour. But they had all, without exception, stopped whatever they were doing and turned their attention to the counter. Not in unison, not in the theatrical way of something choreographed, but in the organic, particular way that happens when a room full of people arrives at the same feeling, at the same time, and makes the same quiet decision about it. They were watching Travis Boone, and Travis Boone knew what that meant. Kyle had gone very still on his stool. He had the look of a man who is rapidly revising his assessment of how the evening was going to end and does not like what the revision is telling him. Ray said again, "Why?" Travis tried once more to find the shape of this. Emily could see him trying, reaching for the posture, the voice, the specific version of himself that had always gotten him through rooms like this. But this room was not like other rooms he'd been in, and the thing that had always worked was not going to work here. And some part of him was arriving at that knowledge in real time, and the arrival was not comfortable. It was just a joke, Travis said. Ray looked at him for a long moment without expression. Tell me the funny part, he said. Travis said nothing. Because she doesn't look like she got the joke, Ray said. And I'm looking at that receipt and I'm not getting it either, so help me out. Where's the funny part? The silence stretched. One of the riders in the back booth, the young one with the shaved head, who had put down his fork an hour ago, leaned back in his seat and crossed his arms, and the sound of the movement, the slight creak of the booth, was audible in the room. It was just, Travis started. Don't, Ray said. Travis stopped. Ray picked up his coffee mug. He held it without drinking from it. He looked at Travis over the rim of it for a moment, and then he set it down and said, I've been doing this for 30 years. Writing, meeting people everywhere we stop. And I've learned something in 30 years about the kind of person who writes something like that on a receipt. He tapped the paper on the counter once with one finger. You know what kind of person does this? Travis said nothing. Someone who felt small somewhere else, Ray said, and decided to make someone else feel smaller, so the math worked out. That's the whole thing. That's the entire explanation. He looked at Travis with something that wasn't contempt. It was more matter of fact than contempt, which was somehow worse. You feel small somewhere, Travis. The use of his name made Travis blink. He hadn't given his name. Someone had at some point in the evening, Emily had said it maybe, or Karen she couldn't remember. But the fact that Ray knew it and was using it now landed differently than names usually landed. I don't know what you want from me, Travis said. His voice had changed. The easiness was gone. What was left underneath it was something rawer, younger, less practiced. I want you to tell me why you came back, Ray said. I told you, dessert. No, Ray said. He was patient with this, the way you're patient with someone who is going to get to the truth eventually, and you're willing to wait. You came back because you wanted to see if she was still bothered. That's why you came back. Emily felt something inside her go very still at those words. Not because they surprised her, she had known it, in the way you know things you don't want to put into words, but because hearing them, said plainly in a room full of people, felt like having a window opened in a place you'd been trying to breathe in for a long time. Travis looked at the counter. He didn't deny it. Ray nodded. Okay, he said. He didn't say it like a victory. He said it like a man completing a piece of work, the particular satisfaction of a thing finished, not celebrated. So now we're going to do something about it. At the service window, Mac had straightened up. Karen was standing near the register with her arms folded, not in the combative way, but in the way of a person who is trying to keep themselves together because something is happening that they didn't expect to feel so much about. Ray looked down the counter at Kyle. You were here both times, he said. Kyle looked at his coffee cup. Yeah, he said, and you didn't say anything either time. He didn't, Kyle started. That's not a question, Ray said. I'm just establishing the facts. You were there. You heard what was said. You saw what was written, and you didn't say anything. He paused. That make you feel good about yourself right now? Kyle's mouth opened, closed. He looked at his hands. The man with the silver glasses still sitting on the stool he'd taken up an hour ago made a sound that wasn't quite anything. Not a laugh, not a word, just the exhale of a man who has heard a question that he thought was the right question. Ray turned back to Travis. Here's what I know about her, he said. I've been sitting at this counter for a little over 2 hours. In that time, she has taken care of 49 people with more patience and more professionalism than most people I've worked with in any context. She has not complained. She has not made a production of anything. She has just worked. He stopped. He let that sit. I don't know her story, but I know people who work like that, and people who work like that have a reason. They've got something they're carrying. He looked at Emily. You mind if I ask you something directly? She shook her head. Is there something specific this money tonight was supposed to go toward? The room was very quiet. Emily looked at Ray Dawson's face and found something there that she hadn't been looking for, not pity, which she would have refused, but a kind of recognition. The look of someone who has known what it is to work hard for a specific, necessary, non-optional reason, and who is asking because they already know the answer and want her to have the dignity of saying it herself. My brother, she said, he's in college. She stopped. She started again. I'm the only one left. Our parents died 2 years ago. I'm the one who makes sure his tuition gets paid. The words came out simpler than she'd expected. She had not said them out loud to anyone, not to Karen, not to Mac, not to the couple from table 4 who had been kind to her earlier. She hadn't said them because saying them made them a thing in the room, a thing with weight and dimension, a thing that other people could look at and respond to, and she hadn't been ready for that. She had carried them alone because carrying them alone felt like the only way to carry them without losing them. She said them now because Ray Dawson had asked like someone who had earned the right to ask. The dining room received the words in silence, not the silence of discomfort or not knowing what to say. The silence of people who have heard something true and are giving it the space it deserves. Travis Boone stood very still. He was looking at Emily. For the first time all night, he was looking at her the way you look at a person rather than a surface, with the attention that registers someone as a full human being who has a life and a history and reasons for the things they do. Emily could not have said what was happening behind his eyes. She wasn't inclined to be generous about it, but something was happening there that hadn't been there before. Ray said, "You wrote on that receipt that she should smile harder if she wants to pay her bills." He picked up the receipt and looked at it one more time. She's been paying her brother's bills, working nights, carrying the whole thing herself. He set it down. And you wrote that. Travis looked at the counter. Look at her, Ray said. Not loud, not mean, just clear. Travis looked up. He looked at Emily. Now tell me, Ray said, why you thought that was all right. The silence that followed was the longest one of the night. It had its own weight, its own specific texture. Emily stood in it and felt the strange vertigo of a moment she hadn't known she was going to have. A moment in which someone had put the question that she had been carrying in her pocket along with that receipt, the question she hadn't even let herself fully articulate out into the open air of a public room and made it real. Why had he thought that was all right? Travis Boone's hands at his sides were no longer loose. His fingers were bent slightly, the way hands bend when a person is trying not to show something physically that they can't stop from being felt. I didn't know, he said. His voice was different. Something had come out of it, the easiness, the patience that wasn't patience, the specific register he'd been using all night. What was left sounded more like a man's actual voice. About the brother, any of that. Would it have changed things? Ray said. A pause. I don't know, Travis said. And the honesty in it, the reluctant, unwilling honesty of a man who is confronting something about himself that he would have preferred to leave unconfronted, was the most real thing he had said all night. Maybe the most real thing he'd said in a long time. That's the problem, Ray said. Right there, you didn't know and you didn't think it mattered that you didn't know. That's the whole thing. He looked at Travis with those steady, unhurried eyes. She wasn't a person to you. She was a target. And the reason you picked her is the same reason people like you always pick someone, because you thought she couldn't do anything about it. Kyle made a small sound, not a word, just the sound of someone receiving something they hadn't been expecting. The young rider with the shaved head had unfolded his arms. He was sitting forward now, elbows on the table, watching the counter with the focused attention of someone watching something that matters. You picked her, Ray continued, because she was alone in this job and she needed the money, and you figured that made her safe to pick. You figured she'd swallow it, that she had to swallow it. He paused. Am I wrong? Travis said nothing. Am I wrong? Ray said again. No, Travis said, quiet, almost inaudible, almost. But the room heard it. Emily heard it. She stood at the counter and heard Travis Boone say, no, you're not wrong. I picked her because I thought she was safe to pick, and she felt something happen in her chest that was not triumph and not relief and not quite anything she had a word for. Something that was closer to the feeling of a door opening after a long time in a closed space, the specific quality of air that comes in the particular relief of it, the way it makes you aware of how much you needed it. She had carried that receipt for 2 hours. She had carried it in her pocket and she had carried it in her chest, and she had not let herself be broken by it because she didn't have room in her life to be broken by it. And now the man who wrote it was standing in front of 49 people and a woman he'd tried to make small and saying out loud that he had chosen her specifically because he'd believed she couldn't defend herself. He had been wrong about that. Not because she had defended herself, she hadn't, not in any way she would have been able to describe, but because the night had turned out to be different than either of them had imagined it would be when it started. Because 49 motorcycles had turned off a highway into a gravel parking lot at 12:17 in the morning. Because Ray Dawson had asked her what the note said. Because she had shown it to him. Ray said, now we're going to fix it. Travis looked at him. Fix it how? However it needs to be fixed, Ray said. He looked at Emily. What was your tip supposed to be tonight? Best guess. Emily shook her head. I'm not asking if you need it, Ray said gently. I'm asking what it should have been. She looked at the table Travis had sat at earlier. She thought about the bill. She thought about what a reasonable tip on a bill like that looked like. 15% would have been, she did the math, about $8. And tonight, both visits full service. Ray, Emily. She stopped. He said her name the same way he'd said it before, like a word that meant something like the name of a person who deserved to be called by it. She looked at him. He was waiting. Maybe $25, $30 total, she said. Between both visits. Ray looked at Travis. You hear that? Travis heard it. Empty your wallet, Ray said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the clear, simple statement of a man who has decided what the next thing is and sees no reason to add drama to it. Travis looked at him for a moment, calculating, still because it was not in his nature to stop calculating, and then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it. He pulled out the bills. He set them on the counter without counting them first, which was its own kind of statement. The departure from his earlier performance with the money, the slow, deliberate counting that was designed to make the absence of a tip feel like an accounting rather than a choice. He set it all down. Emily could see from where she stood that it was significantly more than $30 a month. Ray looked at it. He looked at Travis. Now Kyle, he said, no, I don't. Kyle went into his wallet without being asked twice. The two stacks of bills sat on the counter. Ray looked at them. He looked at Emily. That's yours, he said. All of it. Emily looked at the money. She looked at Ray. That's Ray. That's too much. I can't. It's not too much, Ray said. It's not close to too much. You know why? She knew why. She picked up the money. She folded it and put it in the Noah pocket, the pocket that wasn't the receipt pocket, and her hand was steady when she did it. She was proud of that. Her hand was steady. At the service window, Mac exhaled a long breath and pressed both palms flat on the ledge and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Karen at the register pressed the back of her hand to her mouth briefly. Travis was looking at the counter. There's one more thing, Ray said. Travis looked up. The apology, Ray said. Silence. To her, Ray said. Not to me, not to the room, to her directly. Travis looked at Emily. She held his gaze. She didn't make it easy for him. She didn't soften her expression or look away to give him room to breathe. She had earned the right to look him directly in the face while he decided whether he was capable of doing this one necessary thing. He was. It took him a moment to get there. She could see the journey of it, the resistance, the recalculation, the arrival at a place where the only honest option was the one he'd been avoiding all night. I'm sorry, Travis said. 2 words. Plain, unadorned. She had expected something more complicated, more defensive, more wrapped in the language of almost apology that people used when they wanted credit for the gesture without fully committing to the meaning. But he said it without any of that. Just the 2 words looking directly at her with the particular quality of a man who is saying something he cannot take back and knows it. I'm sorry, he said again. What I wrote it wasn't a joke. It was mean. And I came back because he stopped. He started again. Because I'm the kind of person who does that sometimes. And I don't like that about myself. Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the receipt in her pocket. She thought about the white envelope in her kitchen drawer. She thought about Noah's text, no rush. She thought about her parents who had believed in reciprocity, who had believed that the universe had something built into it if you kept showing up right. Okay, she said. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Not a declaration that everything was fine. Just the word that meant she had heard him, that the thing had been said, that the night could now become something different than what it had been. Travis nodded. He picked up his jacket. He looked at Kyle, who stood immediately. They walked toward the door together, and the room tracked them with eyes that weren't hostile anymore, just present, just watching, giving them the space to leave with whatever dignity the night had left them. At the door, Travis stopped. He turned around one last time. He looked at the dining room, the 49 riders, the counter, the service window where Mac was still standing, Karen at the register, Emily in the middle of it all. I didn't know, he said, about her brother, the parents, none of it. He looked at Emily. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Worse, Ray said from the counter. His voice was mild. Because it means you'd have done it to anyone. Travis absorbed that. He nodded once. And then he pushed the door open and walked out, and Kyle followed, and the bell above the door rang, and the sound of it was the most ordinary sound in the world. The room held its breath for one moment. Then someone in the back booth, the man with the scar along his jaw, who had told Emily her eggs looked perfect, said in a perfectly conversational voice, "Well, that took a while." And the dining room broke open. Not loud, not the explosion of a crowd that's been holding back, not applause or cheering, which would have felt wrong, and they all seemed to know it. But conversation returned, and the sound of silverware, and someone laughed quietly at something someone else said, and the ordinary texture of 49 people in a diner at 2:30 in the morning reasserted itself like water finding its level. Karen walked to the end of the counter and stood beside Emily. She didn't say anything. She just stood there for a moment, close enough that their arms were almost touching, in the way of women who have worked a long shift together and know each other well enough to not need words for everything. Mac disappeared from the service window and then appeared a moment later coming through the kitchen door. He walked the length of the counter to where Emily was standing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You want coffee?" She almost laughed. "I'm fine, Mac." "I'm making some anyway," he said and went back to the kitchen. Ray turned back to the counter. He picked up his mug. He held it and looked at it, and there was something in his posture, the slight release of the shoulders, the settling of a man who has finished a thing he needed to finish, that Emily recognized as the particular tiredness that comes after doing something that was the right thing, but not the easy thing. She went to him. She picked up the coffee pot. She poured. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. She said it quietly, not for the room, just for him. He shook his head, not dismissing her thanks, accepting it actually, but refusing its excess. "You put it on the counter," he said, "the receipt. That's the thing that mattered. You asked me what it said. And you answered," he said. "Some people wouldn't have." He picked up the mug. That took something. She thought about that. She thought about the 2 hours between when she'd first put the receipt in her pocket and when she'd laid it on the counter in front of this man she'd known for less than 2 hours. She thought about all the versions of the night that had existed in potential, in which she'd thrown the receipt away without telling anyone, in which she'd swallowed it and worked around it and carried it home and put it next to the white envelope in the kitchen drawer as another piece of evidence about the specific difficulty of the world. She had not done that. She had been asked, and she had answered. "It did," she admitted. "Take something." Ray nodded. He drank his coffee. She moved on down the counter, checking mugs, checking in, doing the work. The dining room was running again. Mac was back at the grill filling orders for the back half of the room that had arrived while the counter drama had played out. Karen was running checks for 2 tables that were ready to pay. The normal infrastructure of a diner at 2:30 in the morning had reasserted itself. But something had changed. Emily could feel it in the air of the room, not charged anymore, not tense but warmer, heavier in the good way, the way a room feels when something true has happened in it that all the people present were part of and will carry out with them when they go. She topped off the young writer's coffee, the one with the shaved head, and he looked up at her and said, "You got a brother in college?" "I do," she said. "What's he studying?" She almost said she didn't know because she was used to deflecting questions about Noah, used to keeping that part of her life in a separate compartment that she could close and carry. But she thought about his text, no rush. She thought about what it meant to keep carrying things alone. "Engineering, I think," she said. "He keeps changing his mind. Last time we talked, it was engineering. Before that, it was physics." The writer smiled. "Smart kid." "Yeah," she said. "He is." She moved to the next stool. Ray was finishing his coffee. He would signal for the check. Soon she could see them all starting to move in that direction. The particular shift in a group's energy that happens when people have been somewhere long enough and are beginning to think about the road. She had 1 more table in the back to check on, 2 more mugs to refill, and then she would run the checks and they would go and the diner would go quiet again. But first she needed to do one thing. She went to her apron pocket, the receipt pocket. She reached in and her fingers found the folded paper light as paper not heavy anymore, or not as heavy as it had been because things that are spoken have less weight than things that are only carried. She pulled it out. She looked at it 1 more time. "Maybe smiling harder will pay your bills." She walked to the trash can behind the counter. She held the receipt over it. She dropped it. It fell without ceremony, without drama, the ordinary fall of a small piece of paper into a container of other discarded things. It made no sound when it landed. Emily stood there for a moment. Then she straightened up. She picked up the coffee pot. She went back to work. At the corner booth in the back, the man with the scar along his jaw was watching her. When she got to his table to refill, he held out his mug and said in the same mild conversational voice he'd used before, "For what it's worth, everybody in this room saw what you did tonight." She poured his coffee. She looked at him. "I just did my job," she said. He considered that. "Yeah," he said. "You did." He took back his mug. That was kind of the whole point. She moved to the next table. Outside, the highway was quiet. The pre-dawn Arizona dark pressed against the windows that specific hour when the night has run most of its course and the morning hasn't made its mind up yet, when the world exists in a state of held breath. In a few hours, the sky would go from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before orange, and the desert would light up the way it only did in those first 20 minutes of morning, with a clarity and a color that felt almost personal, like the world was trying to tell you something specific. Emily had seen it many times. She would see it again today. She had 4 hours left in her shift, and she was going to work them the same way she had worked the hours before them, with the care and the steadiness that were the only things she'd ever truly owned. But tonight, something had happened that she was going to carry forward differently. She didn't have a word for it yet. She would find one maybe when she got home and took off her uniform and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and counted the money in the Noah pocket and thought about the text her brother had sent. When the receipt was gone and the night was behind her and she could look at what remained. For now, she just kept moving. She was still Emily Carter. And Emily Carter did not stop working just because the shift had turned into something larger than a shift. She went to the next table. She poured the coffee. She kept going. The diner kept running. That was the thing about a room that had just gone through something. It didn't stop being a diner. The coffee still needed pouring. The checks still needed running. The kitchen still had tickets on the wheel, and Mac was still back there, working them with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided that his contribution to the evening was going to be the best food he'd ever sent through that service window, which was not nothing because Mac took his work seriously the way Emily took hers. She moved through the room with the coffee pot, and she refilled and she checked in and she ran tabs in the normalcy of it. The ordinary, repetitive, honest normalcy of the work felt after everything like the most solid ground she had stood on all night. Not because nothing had happened, because everything had, and the work was still there, and the work still asked of her exactly what it had always asked, and she could still give it. Ray was talking to the man on the stool to his left, a writer named Dennis. She'd learned a big quiet man from Tucson who worked HV, AC and wrote on weekends. They were talking about something road-related, something about a route they were going to take in the morning, and the conversation had the low-settled quality of two people who know each other well enough to say exactly what they mean, and nothing extra. She topped off Dennis's coffee. He thanked her without interrupting himself. She moved on. Karen caught her eye from across the room and held up two fingers. Two tables in the back corner were signaling for checks. Emily nodded and went to the register. She pulled up the tables, printed. The checks, carried them back on a small tray, the way she always did, two pens clipped to the edge of the tray. Professional, unhurried, the same as always. At the back table, a man in his 50s with gray at his temples and a calm face she hadn't had much time to look at directly all night, took the check from her and opened it. He looked at it, then he looked up. "You got a brother in school," he said. She recognized him not from before tonight, but from the room. He was one of the men who had been at the table nearest the counter when Ray had read the receipt, one of the ones who had gone still. "I do," she said. "Engineering it," he said. "Or physics. You weren't sure." She looked at him. "You heard that? Room's not that big," he said. He set a credit card on top of the check. "My name's Calvin. I run a fabrication shop outside Phoenix. We apprentice a lot of young engineers." He looked at her steadily. "If your brother ever wants a summer placement paid real work, the kind that looks good on a resume, you tell him to reach out." He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a card, a plain white card with a name and a phone number, and the name of the shop. He set it on the tray. "No obligation. Just put it somewhere you won't lose it." Emily looked at the card. She looked at Calvin. She picked up the card and held it in both hands for a moment, and then she put it in the pocket that had held the receipt. The receipt was gone. The pocket was empty, and now it held something else. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank him when he does something with it." She ran his card and brought it back, and he signed the slip and left a tip that made her breath catch when she saw the number. And she folded it carefully and put it with the rest of the money from that evening. The money was accumulating in her pocket with a weight she could actually feel now, and every time she was aware of it, she thought of Noah's text, "No rush." She thought about calling him at 6 when her shift ended. She thought about what she was going to say when she did. At 3:15, Ray signaled for his check. She printed it and brought it to him. He looked at it without expression. He reached into his vest pocket, not his wallet, his vest pocket, and pulled out a folded sheaf of bills. He counted them out on the counter with the same deliberateness that Travis had used when paying his original bill, except that Ray's deliberateness was not a performance of withholding. It was the deliberateness of someone who is taking care with something that matters. He set the bills onto the counter. She could see immediately that it was more than the check. Significantly more. Ray, she said. Don't, he said. That's two. Emily. He looked at her. In 30 years of writing, I have sat in more diners than I could count. I have been served by a lot of people doing exactly what you did tonight, under a lot of different kinds of pressure. You know how many of them I remember? She waited. Not many, he said. I remember the ones who didn't break, the ones who kept their dignity when someone was working hard to take it from them. He picked up his coffee mug and finished the last of it and set it down with finality. I remember you. That's worth something. She looked at the money on the counter. She wanted to refuse it again. It was in her nature to refuse excess, to insist on proportion, to not take more than she had earned in the strict accounting of labor and wages. But she had earned something tonight that was not in the strict accounting, and Ray knew it, and he was right, and she knew he was right. She picked up the money. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He stood up from the stool and stretched the long, deliberate stretch of a man who has been sitting for a while and is preparing his body for the next thing. He put on his jacket and adjusted the collar of it. Then he stopped. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet, something that was different from the focused steadiness he'd carried through the confrontation, and different from the quiet warmth that had been in his voice when he asked her about Noah. This was something more personal, something that had traveled farther to get here. Can I tell you something? He said. Sure, she said. I started writing when I was 22, he said. I was working construction in Flagstaff, 6 days a week outdoors, whatever the weather was doing. My foreman was a man who believed the best way to get work out of people was to make them feel like they had no other options. He paused. He looked at the counter. He used to say things, not yell, just say things, quietly, in a way that made you feel like whatever you were doing wasn't enough, and whoever you were was the reason for it. He stopped again. I worked for him for 2 years. I was 24 when I finally quit. And the day I quit, he laughed at me, said I'd be back because I didn't have the spine for anything else. Emily was very still. I started writing that same week, Ray said. Bought a bike with 3 months of savings and rode until I ran out of road, and then I turned around and came back. And I learned something on that first ride that I've been carrying ever since. He looked at her directly. The people who tell you that you're not enough, they're always telling you something about themselves, never about you, every single time. She held his gaze. The words landed in her not like information she hadn't known, but like a thing she had known and had needed to hear out loud from someone who had lived it. That was the difference. She could have known it in her own head from 10 feet away, and it would have been one thing. Hearing it from Ray Dawson at 3:17 in the morning in the diner where she'd been working all night was something else entirely. Travis Boone, Ray said, is my old foreman. A different face, different name, same calculation. He found someone doing honest work, and he decided that honest work was something he could use against you. That the wanting of it, the needing of it, made you small. He picked up his jacket from the stool beside him. It doesn't. It never did. You understand me? Yeah, she said. Her voice was steady. She was glad for that. I do. He nodded. He put on his jacket. He was ready. But something was happening in the dining room that neither of them had been paying full attention to in the last few minutes. Emily noticed it because she noticed things. It was the skill the job had built in her, the ability to track a large room's temperature from her peripheral vision while keeping her direct attention focused wherever it needed to be. People were moving, not leaving, not yet, but reorganizing. Riders from the back booths had come to the counter. Some of them were standing rather than sitting, which was unusual given that they'd been seated for the better part of 3 hours. There were conversations happening that had the character of decisions being made rather than small talk being exchanged. Karen was at the register, and she had an expression on her face that Emily couldn't quite read from across the room. Something between confused and overwhelmed, the expression of a woman who is processing several things at once and hasn't finished yet. Emily looked at Ray. Ray was watching the room with the expression of a man who knows what is happening because he made it happen, or at least didn't stop it from happening. What's going on? She said. He didn't answer directly. He turned on his stool toward the room. He raised his voice just enough to carry not loud but pitched for the space. "Gentlemen," he said. The room came to attention in the unhurried way it always did, with Ray not snapping, to not performing readiness, but settling into the kind of quiet that meant they were with him. "We've been here a few hours," Ray said. "Good food, good service." He looked at Emily briefly. "Before we go, I want to make sure we've done right by the people who took care of us tonight." He looked at Dennis. Dennis reached into his vest pocket and put something on the counter. He did it without drama, without looking at Emily, just placed it and looked back at Ray. Calvin from the back table was already at the counter. He set something down beside Dennis's contribution. The man with the red bandana. The one who had gone still 3 stools down from Travis an hour ago. The one who had been the first to feel the room change, stood up from his stool and added to the stack. He didn't look at Emily either, which she found she was grateful for. She didn't want to be looked at right now. She wanted to understand what was happening without having to hold herself together visibly while she understood it. Rider by rider, booth by booth. Not all of them, and not in any particular order. Some got up, some just reached into their pockets from where they sat and passed something forward booth to booth, hand to hand, until it reached the counter. It was not organized in the way of a collection at a church. It was not formal. It was more like watching a tide move. The individual water doesn't decide to go anywhere, but the whole thing goes somewhere together. Karen caught Emily's eye from the register. Karen's expression had resolved itself. She was not confused anymore. She was looking at Emily with the open, unguarded face of a woman who was feeling something she didn't have a ready defense against. Emily looked at the counter. She looked at what was accumulating there. She looked at Ray. "No," she said. Her voice came out thicker than she intended. She cleared her throat. "Ray, you don't need to." "It's not about need," Ray said. His voice was mild. "You know what I told you earlier about the people who work hard for a reason, about remembering the ones who don't break." He looked at the counter, at what had been placed there. Every man in this room has had a job that ground them down. Construction, military, factories, truck driving, every kind of work that asks everything and gives back just enough. Every single one of us has stood where you're standing, up all night doing it right, and had someone decide that made us a target. He paused. "This isn't charity, this is recognition. There's a difference." Emily stood at the counter and looked at the money that riders who did not know her name 24 hours ago had placed there because they had watched her work and watched her hold herself together and watched her put a piece of paper on a counter when she had every reason to keep it in her pocket and had decided that meant something worth responding to. Her eyes were burning. She had not cried all night. She had made that decision 2 hours ago in the kitchen with her palms flat on the cold steel, and she had held it through everything that had come. After, through Travis coming back through the receipt on the counter, through Ray's questions and Travis's apology, and the long exhale of the room when it was done. She was holding it now. She was holding it, but just barely. The man with the scar along his jaw, the one who had told her everybody in the room saw what she did tonight, appeared at the counter. He set down his contribution with the others. He looked at her with those quiet eyes. "I've got a daughter about your age," he said. "She works in a hospital, night shifts." He looked at the counter and then back at her. "When I go home, I'm going to tell her about tonight." Emily pressed her lips together. She nodded. The young rider with the shaved head was the last one. He came to the counter and he was 29 or 30, young enough to still carry some restlessness in the way he moved, old enough to have done something with it. He set down his money and looked at her and said, "My mom worked nights for 12 years, 3 kids, did it alone." He stopped. He shrugged the shrug of someone who has more to say and has decided that the summary is enough. So, it was the most complete sentence Emily had heard all night. She picked up the money from the counter. All of it. She didn't count it. She couldn't have counted it, not right now, not with her hands doing what they were doing. She held it in both hands for a moment, and then she put it in her apron pocket and pressed her hand flat against the outside of the pocket, the way you press your hand against something you want to be sure is real. "Thank you," she said. It came out rough. She didn't apologize for that. "All of you. I don't..." She stopped. She started again. "I don't have the right words." "You don't need them," Ray said. He was standing now, jacket on, ready for the road. He looked at her with that same calm that had characterized everything he'd done from the moment he'd walked through her door. "You already said everything that needed saying tonight. You said it when you put that receipt on the counter. She thought about that. She thought about the 2 seconds it had taken, the unfolding, the setting down the paper lying flat under the fluorescent light. 2 seconds that had been their own kind of decision. She'd made it without planning it, without calculating the odds, without knowing what it would set in motion. She'd made it because Ray had asked, and she had answered, and that was the whole of it. It had been enough. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead," Ray said. "Where are you headed in the morning?" He looked at her. Something shifted at the edge of his mouth, not quite a smile, but related to one. "North," he said. "We're doing a run-up to the reservation hospital in Tuba City. Annual thing. We bring supplies. Stuff the hospital needs that they can't always get funded. Medical equipment, kids stuff, whatever the need is this year." He paused. "Been doing it 11 years. She looked at him. She thought about what she had assumed about these men when they'd first pulled into the parking lot. She thought about the assumption and what it had cost her, or nearly cost her, before she'd pushed it aside and picked up the menus and walked out to meet them. 11 years, she said. "My wife's from there," Ray said simply. "Her grandmother was treated at that hospital in the 70s. Not well. We've been trying to make it right in the ways we can." He shrugged the shrug of a man who does not need his reasons to be impressive, who has made his peace with the private scale of things. "It's not enough. It's what we can do." Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her parents. She thought about her father driving to work on a Tuesday morning, and her mother lasting 7 months after. She thought about the things that were not enough and the things that were what you could do, and the way those two categories were sometimes, if you were honest about it, the same category. She thought about the receipt. She thought about what Ray had said: the people who tell you that you're not enough are always telling you something about themselves. She had been told for 2 hours by a man with a particular kind of cruelty and a particular kind of emptiness that she was not enough. And she had gone into the kitchen and pressed her palms on the steel and breathed, and she had come back out and kept working. And then something she had not arranged or anticipated had arrived in the parking lot and walked through her door and sat at her counter and asked her a question she had been ready to answer. She had been ready. She hadn't known she was ready, but she had been. "Thank you for stopping," she said. "Tonight, here." Ray picked up his helmet from the stool beside him. He turned it in his hands. He looked at her. "We were going to come through here anyway," he said. "We always stop at Rose Creek on the way north. Mac's eggs are worth the detour." He glanced toward the kitchen with something affectionate in it. "But I'm glad we were here tonight." "Me too," she said. He nodded. He moved toward the door. At the door he stopped, and she braced herself, because he had stopped at thresholds before, and what he said when he stopped at them had mattered. But this time he just turned back and looked at the room. The full room, all the riders who were now beginning to get up, beginning to gather themselves. The motion of departure spreading through the space the way the motion of arrival had, in its own order, in its own time. He looked at all of them. "Good night," he said. It was not a speech. It was not a summary or a moral or a final statement on the meaning of the evening. It was just what you said when you were leaving somewhere, and the night had been good, or had become good, or had been made into something that deserved the word. The room answered him, not in unison in the overlapping, layered way that real rooms answered. Things, a dozen different voices saying goodnight and see you and be safe out there and drive careful, the ordinary language of departure, real and warm and sufficient. Karen was at the door. She had stationed herself there without making it look like a station. She was just there close to the exit, and as each rider went by, she thanked them and they thanked her, and the exchange was brief and genuine. And she stood up straighter with each one, as though each brief handshake or nod was adding something back to her rather than taking something away. Mac came out of the kitchen. He never came out of the kitchen. In 11 months, Emily had seen Mac leave the kitchen during a shift exactly twice, once when the fire suppression system had given a false alarm, and once when a customer had started crying in a way that Mac felt required his specific presence. He came out now and stood at the end of the counter and watched the riders file out, and he did not say anything, but his face had the open, undefended quality of a man who has witnessed something that got past his usual perimeter, and he has decided this once to let it. Dennis, on his way to the door, stopped at the counter beside Mac. He looked at him for a moment. "Good cook," he said. Mac nodded. "Good eaters," he said. Dennis laughed, a real laugh, short and genuine, and kept walking. The last rider through the door was Calvin. He paused in the doorway and looked back at Emily and said, "You going to call your brother tonight?" She thought about the text, no rush. She thought about the Noah pocket, the weight of it. She thought about what she was going to say. "When my shift ends," she said, 6 o'clock. "Tell him about tonight," Calvin said. She started to say something. She wasn't sure what, some version of maybe or probably the deflective language of someone who is still figuring out what the night had been, before she could decide how to tell it. But Calvin was already through the door. The bell rang, and then it was just the diner, just Emily and Karen and Mac and the empty tables and the cooling coffee and the 4 a.m. silence of a roadside restaurant outside Flagstaff, Arizona. Karen let out a long breath. Mac went back to the kitchen without a word. Emily stood in the middle of the dining room. She stood there for a moment and let herself feel it, all of it, the whole long accumulation of the night from 9:47, when Travis and Kyle had first walked in, to this moment, 4:13 in the morning, the diner empty and quiet, and hers again. She reached into her apron pocket, the Noah pocket. She pulled out the money. She held it in both hands and looked at it. She counted it, slowly, carefully, the way she counted the Noah envelope at the end of every week. Her hands were steadier than she expected. When she finished counting, she stood very still. Then she sat down in the nearest booth, sat down for the first time all night, just sat in the booth where the man with the silver glasses had eaten his pie, and she held the money in her lap and looked at the ceiling and breathed. It was more than the tuition payment. It was more than 2 tuition payments. It was the thing she had been calculating against for 2 years, the specific number she had been working toward in the careful, methodical, never quite getting their way that made her lie awake some nights doing math in her head, the number that would mean Noah could actually finish, without her having to make any more of the hard decisions about which bills got delayed, so the envelope stayed full. She sat in the booth and looked at the ceiling. Karen appeared at the edge of the booth. She sat down across from Emily without asking which was correct. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Emily with the face of a woman who has seen a lot of long shifts and knows that some of them end differently than others. "Okay," Karen said. Emily looked at her. Her eyes were burning again. She didn't fight it this time. "Yeah," she said. "I think so." Karen looked at the money in Emily's hands. She didn't say anything about it directly. She just looked at it and then looked back at Emily with the expression of someone doing the same math Emily had just done and arriving at the same place. "The brother," she said. "Yeah," Emily said. Karen nodded. She unfolded her hands. She put one of them flat on the table in a gesture that was not quite reaching out, but was as close to it as the context allowed. She left it there. "You never told me," Karen said, "about the parents, any of it." "No," Emily said. "You've been carrying all of this." "Yeah." Karen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My ex left 3 years ago. I've got Maya by myself, middle school, which is its own particular version of impossible, and I'm doing it alone." She looked at the table. "I didn't tell you either." Emily looked at her. "So," Karen said. "So." The same word the young writer had used. The same compression of things that didn't need to be made larger than they were because the size of them was already understood. "Maya's good," Emily said. "She's great, actually," Karen said. And the way she said it, the particular pride of a woman talking about her child, quick and undefended, made Emily smile. A real smile, the first one that had come naturally all night. "Good," Emily said. They sat there in the booth for a moment, 2 women at 4:15 in the morning, in a diner that had gone quiet after a long and specific kind of night, not saying much, not needing to. Then Emily put the money back in her pocket. She straightened up. She slid out of the booth. 6 tables to reset," she said. Karen looked at her. You don't have to." 6 tables," Emily said, "and the counter needs wiping, and the salt shakers need refilling, and someone needs to restock the napkin holders." She picked up her coffee pot. She looked at Karen. "Come on." Karen looked at her for a moment. Then she slid out of the booth and stood up and straightened her apron. They went to work. They reset the booths from the back forward, moving through the room, the way they always did at the end of a rush, efficiently, without discussing the division of labor, each one taking what made sense, covering each other's blind spots, the way people do when they've worked the same space long enough to know each other's rhythms. Emily refilled the salt shakers. Karen restocked the napkins. Emily wiped the counter from end to end, the full length of it, every stool, every surface. At the far end of the counter, raised stool, she stopped. She set down the cloth. She looked at the stool. She thought about a man who had started writing when he was 24, with 3 months of savings and a foreman's laughter in his ears, who had ridden until he ran out of road and come back with something he hadn't had before. She thought about 11 years of runs to a hospital in Tuba City. She thought about his wife's grandmother and the things that were not enough and the things that were what you could do. She thought about what he had said to her. The people who tell you that you're not enough are always telling you something about themselves. Never about you. Every single time. She picked up the cloth, she wiped the counter, she moved on. At 5:45, Gary Pittman came in from the parking lot blinking and rumpled with the look of a man who has slept in his truck and is pretending he hasn't. He surveyed the diner clean reset running smoothly, the breakfast prep already started by Mac in the kitchen, and then looked at Emily behind the counter and said, "Quiet night." Emily looked at him. She thought about the answer to that question. She thought about all the shapes a night could take. "Mostly," she said. Gary nodded satisfied and went to pour himself a coffee. Emily picked up her pot and made her rounds. At 6:02, her shift ended. She took off her apron and folded it over her arm and picked up her bag from the back. She said goodbye to Karen, who was on through the morning. She said goodbye to Mac, who said, "See you tonight," without looking up from the grill, which was his version of warmth, and she knew it and appreciated it. She walked to the door. She pushed it open. She stepped out into the parking lot. The sky was the deep blue that came before orange. The desert was about to light up. She could feel it coming, that particular clarity that she had seen on more mornings than she could count, that still had the power to stop. Her still felt like the world trying to tell her something specific. She stood in the parking lot in the early morning cool and reached into her pocket, the Noah pocket, and felt the weight of it against her palm. Then she took out her phone. She pulled up Noah's contact. His last text, "No rush." She looked at the sky. She pressed call. It rang twice. He picked up on the third ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant whatever the financial aid letter said had been keeping him awake, the same way it had been keeping her awake across a different kind of night. "Hey," he said. His voice was careful, the voice of someone braced. "Hey," she said, a pause. "You okay? It's early." "I just got off shift," she said. She looked at the horizon where the first edge of orange was beginning to show. "I saw your text, the financial aid thing." She heard him exhale. "Yeah, there's a gap. For next semester. It's not huge, but it's..." "How much?" she said. He told her the number. She had the number in her pocket. She had more than the number in her pocket. "Okay," she said. A pause. "Okay, what does that mean?" "It means it's okay," she said. "I've got it." Another pause, longer. "Emily, you don't have to..." "Noah." She stopped him the same way Ray had stopped her, earlier, gently, clearly, with the authority of someone who has decided what the truth is. "I've got it. Okay, I've got it." She heard him breathe. She heard the specific quality of the breath, the release in it, the relief the sound a person makes when a weight they've been carrying gets lifted by someone else, and they're not sure whether to feel grateful or guilty, and they feel both, and underneath both is just the clean, simple relief of it. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay. And listen," she said, "something happened tonight. I want to tell you about it." "Yeah." A different quality in his voice, now awake, present. The quiet brightness that had always been his particular register when something interested him. She had missed that sound. She hadn't known she'd missed it until she heard it. "Yeah," she said. She stopped. She tried to find the beginning of it. "It started with a receipt," she said. The sky was turning orange now. She stood in the parking lot of Rust Creek Diner outside Flagstaff, Arizona at 6:04 in the morning, and she told her brother about the night. She told him about Travis and the receipt and the walk to the kitchen. She told him about the engines on the highway and the 49 headlights and Ray Dawson asking her what the note said. She told him all of it, and he listened the way he had always listened, fully, without interrupting, with the whole of his attention, and when she got to the end of it, or as close to the end as she could get while standing in a parking lot watching the desert come alive, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You showed him the receipt." "Yeah," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, "but you did." "Yeah." Another pause. "I'm glad you did," Noah said. And his voice had something in it that she had not heard from him in a long time, not since before their parents died maybe, or in the early days after. Before grief had made them both more careful with each other, more measured, more protective of the things they were afraid to need. Something open, something that trusted the night to have been what it was. I'm really glad you did, Em. She looked at the horizon. The orange was spreading. Me too, she said. She drove home with the windows down. It was the thing she always did after a long shift, cracked both windows and let the morning air come through, even in summer, even when the air was already warming toward the day's heat. It was the closest thing she had to a ritual for the space between the two and the rest of her life, a way of clearing the seam between the two, of letting one thing finish before another thing started. Usually it worked. Usually by the time she pulled into the lot behind her apartment building, she had separated enough from the shift to sleep. She was not going to sleep today. She knew it from the moment she hung up with Noah and got into her car. The conversation had left her too awake, not the anxious wakefulness of someone who cannot settle, but the bright particular alertness of someone who has come through something and is still standing and has noticed with something close to surprise that the standing feels different than it did before. Like the ground under it had shifted overnight. Like she was in the same place but was not quite the same person who had arrived at Rust Creek Diner the previous evening at 7:30 to start her prep. She drove the 12 miles to her apartment with the early morning light coming in sideways through the windshield and the desert opening out on both sides of the highway in the clean particular beauty it only had at this hour. And she thought about the night. She thought about it the way you think about something you know you will be returning to for a long time, not processing it, not filing it, just holding it while it was still warm. She pulled into her lot at 6:29. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out the money and held it in both hands in the quiet of the car and looked at it. She had counted it once at the diner, standing in the booth where the man with the silver glasses had eaten his pie. She counted it again now slowly in the morning light coming through the windshield. She went through it bill by bill, careful and complete. And when she reached the end of the count, she sat with the number in her head for a long moment. It was more than she had thought when she'd counted the first time. One of the riders, she didn't know which one she hadn't seen it happen, had slipped something extra into the stack at some point between the counter and the booth, something she hadn't accounted for in the first count. A fold of bills tucked inside the larger fold, the way you tuck a letter inside an envelope when you don't want the envelope to announce what it carries. She sat in the parking lot and felt something move through her that was not any single thing. She had a word for it, was made of several things at once, relief and gratitude, and the particular vertigo of a person who has been braced for impact for so long that when the impact doesn't come, the absence of it feels almost physical. She put the money back in her pocket. She got out of the car. Upstairs, she took off her uniform and hung it on the back of the bathroom door, the way she always did. She sat down at the kitchen table in her regular clothes jeans and an old gray t-shirt that had been her father's that she wore on the mornings after long shifts because it was soft and familiar and smelled like nothing anymore but still felt like something. She made coffee. She put both hands around the mug when it was ready and looked out the window at the street below, which was just beginning to get its morning traffic, a delivery truck, a man, walking a dog, the ordinary machinery of a day getting started. She opened the kitchen drawer. The white envelope was there. She took it out. She set it on the table in front of her. She had not written the number on the outside of it, just the word Noah. She had always thought that writing the number would make the gap between what was in it and what was needed too concrete, too visible, too easy to despair about on the bad weeks. So she just written his name. His name was always enough to remind her why it mattered. She opened the envelope. She counted what was inside the accumulated weeks, the patient accumulation of tips and wages, and the occasional $5 pressed into her hand by a woman who'd forgotten her reading glasses. She knew the number before she finished counting. She'd known it to the dollar for 3 weeks. She added the money from her pocket. She counted the total. She sat with the number for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and opened her banking app and looked at what Noah's next tuition payment required and looked at what she now had, and the two numbers were not equal in the way she had always dreamed of them. Being equal with the account number winning with more there than was needed, they were that. The account won. For the first time in 2 years, what she had was more than what was required. She set the phone down on the table. She pressed both palms flat on the table surface. She breathed. She did not cry. She had held that back all night, and she held it now not because she was ashamed of it, but because what she felt was not the kind of thing that needed tears. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of something clicking into alignment after a long time out of true, not dramatic, not sudden, just the clean, simple rightness of a thing finally being what it was supposed to be. She put the money back in the envelope. She sealed it. She put the envelope back in the drawer. She drank her coffee. She thought about calling Noah again, but it was not yet 7, and she had already talked to him once this morning, which was more than she usually managed on a workday. She thought about what he had sounded like at the end of the call, the open quality of his voice, the relief that had moved through it when she said she had it. She thought about the last 2 years of carefully not telling him things, of managing his knowledge of their financial situation, the way you manage a patient's knowledge of a prognosis, giving them enough to not be blindsided, withholding enough to not take away the future before it arrives. She was going to have to stop doing that. Not all at once. She knew herself well enough to know it wouldn't be all at once. But she had shown Ray Dawson a receipt she had not planned to show anyone, and the night had turned on that moment, had reorganized itself entirely around the fact of her willingness to stop carrying a thing alone. And she understood that something in her had understood before she could articulate it, that this was the principle. That the carrying alone was not actually strength. That it was a different thing, a necessary thing sometimes, but a different thing from strength. She finished her coffee. She washed the mug. She went to bed. She slept. She slept for 6 hours without waking, which was more than she usually slept after a shift. And when she woke at 1:20 in the afternoon, she lay in bed for a few minutes in the specific stillness of someone who has come out of a deep and dreamless sleep and is reorienting to the world. She looked at the ceiling. She listened to the street below the window. She let herself come back slowly. Then her phone buzzed. She picked it up. A text from a number she didn't recognize, Arizona area code, but not in her contacts. "This is Calvin Reyes. We met last night. Just wanted to let you know I spoke to my foreman this morning. Apprenticeship slot is available starting September. If your brother's interested, tell him to send an email to the address on the card. No obligation. But the offer is real." She read the text twice. She put the phone down on the nightstand. She stared at the ceiling. She picked the phone back up and typed, "Thank you. I'll tell him." She sent it. She put the phone down again. September. Noah had a summer before September, 3 months that he usually spent working whatever he could find, enough to cover books in the gap. Months between 8 disbursements. 3 months that he could spend instead doing real engineering work at a fabrication shop outside Phoenix, the kind of work that built something on a resume, the kind that a professor would point to when writing a recommendation letter and say, "This student has done real things in the world, not just classroom things." She thought about what Noah would say when she told him. She thought he would go quiet in the way he went quiet when something surprised him. Not quiet from reluctance, but from the specific quality of attention he gave, things that mattered. She thought he would ask a question precise and considered the kind of question that showed he had already started thinking about it seriously. She thought he would say yes. She got up. She made a second cup of coffee. She sat back down at the kitchen table, and this time she did not look out the window. She looked at the drawer where the envelope was. She thought about her parents. Her father had driven to work on a Tuesday morning, and his heart had made its decision. Her mother had lasted 7 months. In the 2 years since Emily had thought about them, in the specific way of someone who has not had time to grieve fully, in fragments and stolen moments, in the small hours of overnight shifts, when the diner was quiet and there was nothing to do but feel the shape of the absence. She had thought about them, but she had not always let herself fully think about what they would say if they could see the 2 years since. She had avoided that calculation because she hadn't been sure on the hardest weeks what the answer would be. She let herself think about it now. She thought about what her father would say about the night at Rust Creek. He had been a man of very few words and very clear values, a man who believed that work was a form of respect, that when you did your job with care, you were doing something that mattered beyond the transaction of it. He would have understood immediately what Emily had done by not breaking. He would not have been surprised. He had expected that of her, had expected it the way you expect things from people you know to their core without question or qualification. He would have liked Ray Dawson, she was sure of that. He would have recognized in Ray something that he himself had carried, the particular quality of a man who has been through a grinding thing and come out the other side without letting it make him smaller, who has taken the lesson it offered and made something useful of it. Her father had done that kind of taking too. He had done it quietly the way he did most things, but she had seen it. She thought about her mother who had been less quiet about things and more direct, who had believed that you said what was true when it mattered, and that the world was mostly made of people trying their best and deserved the benefit of the doubt until they proved otherwise. Her mother would have had things to say about Travis Boone, pointed things clear. The kind of things that left no room for ambiguity about the nature of a person who wrote that on a receipt. But she also would have had things to say about the 49, about Calvin's card, about Karen sitting down across from Emily in the booth at 4:15 in the morning. She would have said, of course. She would have said it in the tone she used for things that had confirmed rather than surprised her. Of course they were good. Of course someone helped. Of course the night turned out to contain more than the worst part of it. Her mother had believed that, had lived by it, had died holding it. Emily sat at the kitchen table at 1:40 in the afternoon and thought about her parents and felt the shape of them prisoned and gone. And she did not cry and did not cry. She just held it. That was all. She just let it be what it was, which was a loss that was also a ground, a grief that was also an inheritance, a weight she carried that was also in the truest accounting. A gift. She picked up her phone. She texted Noah the Calvin information. She sent him a photo of the business card. She wrote, "Call me when you're out of class. I have things to tell you." He replied 4 minutes later. "Out at 3, calling you at 3:01. She put the phone in her pocket and went to the window. The afternoon outside was hot and bright. The July Arizona heat doing what it always did in the afternoon, pressing down unambiguous, asking nothing of you but acknowledgement. She stood at the window and looked at the street and thought about the night ahead. She had another shift at Rust Creek in 6 hours. She would put her uniform back on and drive the 12 miles and push through the door and stand behind the counter and pour coffee and take orders and reset tables and do every part of the work the way she had always done it. But she would do it as someone who had made a particular choice at a particular moment in the small hours of a Friday night, who had unfolded a piece of paper and set it on a counter, who had answered when she was asked. She would do it knowing what that choice had set in motion and what it had given back. She would do it with Calvin's card in her apron pocket where the receipt used to be. And somewhere between now and the next shift, she needed to figure out how to tell Mac that she had saved his eggs from being the most important thing a stranger had said to her last night and that he had barely lost. She was smiling when she thought it. At 3:02, her phone rang. "Hey," Noah said, and she could hear from the first word that he had already seen the photo of the card, had already looked up. The shop had already done the thing he always did with information that interested him, which was absorb it rapidly and begin thinking about it seriously before he had even acknowledged receiving it. "Hey," she said. "Calvin Reyes," he said. "Reyes Fabrication in Phoenix. They do structural components for commercial construction. High-tolerance metalwork." A pause. "Emily, that's real work." "I know," she said. "How did you, he was just there at the diner." "He was passing through," she said. "He heard me mention you." "Just heard you mention me." "It was that kind of night," she said. A pause. She could hear him thinking the specific quality of his silence when he was thinking seriously, which was different from his silence when he was just listening. "I want to hear all of it," he said. "You said you had things to tell me." "I do," she said. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Don't leave anything out." She leaned against the wall by the window. The afternoon light was coming in at an angle, warm and direct. Outside, a car went by with its radio on something she couldn't identify, just the bass line passing and fading. "Okay," she said. So it was 9:47, and 2 men walked into the diner. She told him. All of it this time, the parts she'd summarized on the phone at 6 in the morning, and the parts she'd skipped because it was early and she was standing in a parking lot and hadn't been ready to say them yet. She told him about Travis watching her pour coffee and deciding she was worth watching. She told him about the onion rings and the dried-out pie and the specific theater of a man who had decided to make an ordinary night into a performance. She told him about the receipt. She told him what it said. Noah was quiet when she said what it said. "He wrote that," Noah said. "Yeah." "On the receipt and left it." "Yeah." "And then came back," Noah said, because she had told him that part too. "And then came back," she said. She heard Noah breathe. She knew that breath. It was the breath of someone who is feeling something they don't have a fully satisfying outlet For who is sitting with anger that has nowhere immediate to go and is deciding how to hold it? She had felt that breath from him before twice in the weeks after their parents died, when the world kept going in its ordinary way, and the ordinary way of it was briefly intolerable. Noah, she said. I know, he said. Keep going. She kept going. She told him about the sound from outside the low and far away and rhythmic sounds she had mistaken for thunder. She told him about counting the headlights as they turned off the highway. She told him about going to the door with a stack of menus because they were customers and she had a job. 49, Noah said. 49, she confirmed. She told him about Ray Dawson. She told him the way Ray had sat at the counter and watched without appearing to watch, the way he'd said 2 words to Travis, come here, and the room had shifted on those 2 words. She told him about the receipt going flat on the counter under the light. She told him what Ray had asked and what Travis had said and what the room had done with the silence that followed. When she got to the apology, Noah was quiet again. Then he said, "Did you believe it?" The question surprised her. She thought about it seriously, gave it the same weight she'd been giving the night since it ended. The first time he said it, no, she said. The second time, yeah, I think I did. She paused. Not because he's a good person. I don't know if he is, but because he said something true about himself. He said he was the kind of person who did that sometimes, and he said he didn't like it. She stopped. I don't know, that's harder to say than just sorry. Yeah, Noah said quietly. It is. She told him about throwing the receipt away. She told him about the money on the counter. She stopped herself before she told him the amount because she wanted to give him the buildup, first wanted him to understand the weight of it before she gave him the number. She told him about sitting in the booth. She told him about Karen sitting across from her. She told him about Maya in middle school and an ex-husband and 2 car payments, and she heard Noah make a small sound that she recognized as him filing this information. Karen's story, the way it rhymed with theirs, the way their mother would have said, of course. She told him about Calvin's apprenticeship offer. She told him about Ray stopping at the door and turning back and telling the room goodnight. And then she told him about the parking lot and the envelope and the count. She told him the number. The silence that followed was the longest one of the conversation. Emily, Noah said. Yeah, she said. He stopped. Started again. That's more than next semester. It's more than both semesters, she said. Next year is covered. Full year. She heard him breathe again. This breath was different from the earlier one, not the breath of someone sitting with anger, but something older and less manageable. She recognized it because she had felt its equivalent standing in a parking lot at 6 in the morning with the desert coming alive around her. The breath of a weight lifting. The sound of it. Noah started. I know, she said. For how long? It wasn't quite a question. She answered it anyway. Since the beginning, she said. Since the hospital bills and the estate and all of it. I've been keeping the math separate so you could, she stopped. So you didn't have to worry about it. A long pause. Noah, she said. I'm here, he said. His voice was careful, the careful voice he used when he was feeling too much to let it be unguarded. I'm going to stop doing that, she said, keeping it separate. You're 21, not 12. You can know things. I'm not saying it was wrong, she said. I'm saying it's done. We're on the other side of it now. She paused. You're going to call Calvin Reyes tomorrow morning. You're going to tell him you're interested in the apprenticeship, and you're going to ask about the work and not the money first, because that's the right order. A beat. Okay, he said. And next time something costs money, she said, you're going to tell me, not around the edges of it, directly. Okay, he said again. And this time there was something else in it, not just compliance, but the sound of a young man adjusting to a new version of things, accepting a different arrangement with his own story. It was a sound she hadn't heard from him before. It was a sound that meant he was growing into it or had already grown into it and was just now letting her see that. She felt something loosen in her chest. Dad would have liked Ray, she said. A pause, then Noah said, yeah, he would have. Another pause. Mom would have shown up at the diner the next night with a pie. Emily laughed. She put her hand over her mouth because it surprised her, the laugh, and the fact that it was real, and the fact that it had come from talking about their mother, which usually didn't produce laughter. But it was right. It was true. Their mother absolutely would have shown up at Rust Creek Diner with a pie for Ray Dawson's crew, and she would have stayed until she'd told each one of them something specific and true that they needed to hear. She absolutely would have, Emily said. They stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes, not always talking, sometimes just existing on the line in the particular way of two people who have run out of necessary things to say but aren't ready to end the call. Noah told her about his engineering class, about a problem set that had been giving him trouble, that he'd finally worked out in the shower. She told him about Mac and the eggs, and he laughed the same way she had laughed, surprised by it, and then not surprised at all. When they finally hung up, it was almost 4 o'clock. She had 2 hours before she needed to leave for work. She changed. She pressed her uniform the way she always did, with the hand iron careful at the collar and the cuffs. She made sure the name tag was straight. She ate something which she sometimes forgot to do between shifts and was trying to do better about. She sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and looked at the afternoon light coming through the window and thought about nothing specific for a while, which was a luxury she rarely allowed herself and allowed herself now. At 5:15, her phone buzzed again. A different, unknown number. Text message? Only, "My name is Kyle Mercer. I was with Travis last night. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to say that I watched what happened and I didn't say anything when I should have, and I've been thinking about that all day. I'm sorry. That's all." She read it twice. She thought about Kyle, the lean, quiet one, the one with the pale eyes that moved around a room taking inventory. She thought about the way he had agreed with everything Travis said all night, the specific compliance of a man who has organized his life around not being the one who causes friction. She thought about Ray asking him directly, "You were there. You didn't say anything. That make you feel good about yourself right now?" She typed back, "Thank you for saying so." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she added, "It's not too late to be different." She sent it. She put her phone in her pocket. She didn't know if Kyle Mercer would do anything with that. She didn't know if Travis Boone would go home to something in his life that he looked at differently tonight than he had looked at it yesterday. She didn't know if the night at Rust Creek would leave any mark on either of them, past the immediate discomfort of being confronted with themselves in a room full of people who didn't look away. She didn't need to know. That was not her part of it. Her part of it had been the receipt on the counter and the steady hands and the work she had kept doing when the easier thing would have been to fold. Whatever happened next with Travis and Kyle was their own calculation to make their own work to do or decline to do. She had done hers. She picked up her bag. She took one last look at the kitchen drawer, the envelope inside it sealed with Noah's name on the front. She walked out. She drove the 12 miles with the windows down. The evening air was still warm, but different from the afternoon. The desert had a way of shifting at this hour, the heat starting to release its grip by degrees, as though the day itself was exhaling. She drove with one hand on the wheel and the window down, and the wind coming through and the highway running straight and long through the desert toward the diner, and she felt not happy exactly, not the simple, uncomplicated happiness that the word usually meant. Something steadier than that. Something that had been earned rather than given, that was made of the actual specific material of the last 24 hours and therefore was not going to dissolve when the novelty wore off. She pulled into the Rust Creek parking lot at 5:58. She sat in the car for a moment. The sign was blinking the way it always blinked, irregularly, the second letter of rust fading in and out. The parking lot was empty at this hour, the early dinner traffic not yet arrived, the overnight crowd hours away. The diner looked exactly the way it always looked at this hour, ordinary roadside plain, a building doing the honest work of being exactly what it was. She got out of the car. She walked across the gravel lot. At the door, she stopped. She put her hand on the handle. She thought not for long, just for the space of one breath, about the night before, about the bell ringing at 9:47 and two men who had decided she was the right kind of target, about 12:17 and the headlights turning off the highway, about a receipt lying flat on a counter under fluorescent light, about a man turning on a stool and saying, "Come here," in a voice that had the weight of 30 years behind it. She thought about throwing the receipt in the trash, about the particular sound of paper landing on paper light in ordinary without ceremony. She thought about what had replaced it. Then she pulled the door open and walked in. Mac was at the grill. He looked up when she came through. He looked back down at the grill. "Heard you had a night," he said. She hung her bag in the back and clipped on her name tag and came back out front. "Karen talked to you." Karen talks to everybody, he said, which was not an answer but was also entirely accurate. She picked up a coffee pot. She checked the tables, 3 needed resetting. 1 had been done, but the salt shaker was empty. She went about it, systematic, unhurried, present. Mac ice, she said. He flipped something on the grill without looking up. Yeah. A man named Ray Dawson said your eggs were worth a detour. A pause. Mac's spatula stopped moving for a moment. Then it started again. Did he? He did. Another pause. Mac said. Just that, but she had been working beside Mac for 11 months, and she knew his register knew the difference between his neutral sounds and his not neutral sounds, and that was not a neutral sound. That was the sound of a man who has been told something that reached him and is not going to let on how much. She let it go. She finished resetting the tables. She refilled the salt shakers. She straightened the menus in the holder by the door and wiped down the counter end to end the full length of it every surface. She stopped at the far end, Ray's stool. She stood there for a moment, the cloth in her hand, and she looked at the stool and she thought about him turning on it, the full deliberate turn, the way he'd said, "Come here," to a man who had been running the room all night. She thought about him reading the receipt without picking it up. She thought about his voice when he told her about the foreman, about being 24 with 3 months of savings and a motorcycle and a road that eventually ran out. She thought about what he'd said at the end of it. Never measure your worth by the people who refuse to see it. She had measured herself for 2 years in the white envelope in the kitchen drawer. In the running total, she kept in the back of her mind the weekly count, the careful calculation of what was needed against what was there. She had measured herself in the overnight shifts and the pressed uniform and the name tag kept straight and the table reset after every customer, regardless of how that customer had treated her. She had never measured herself by Travis Boone's receipt. She had felt it. She had put it in her pocket and felt it. But she had not measured herself by it. Not really, because underneath the feeling had always been the knowledge, not loud, not confident, but their persistent quiet the way real things are quiet, that the receipt was a document about him, not about her. It had taken Ray Dawson reading it in a room full of 49 people to make that knowledge loud enough to keep. She wiped the counter at Ray's stool. She polished it. She set a fresh napkin and clean silverware in front of it, the same as every other stool, prepared for whoever came next. Ready. She stood behind the counter and looked at the diner, the tables reset and waiting, the kitchen running, the first glow of the parking lot lights coming on outside as the evening deepened. She was 23 years old. She was still working the overnight at Russ Creek. She had a brother who was going to call, Calvin Reyes, in the morning, who was going to spend a summer building real things with his hands and his mind. She had a mother who would have brought a pa and a father who would have nodded once and meant everything by it. She had 49 reasons to believe that the world was not reducible to the cruelty of its worst moments. She had Karen and Mac and a phone in her pocket and a drawer in her kitchen that finally held more than what was needed. She had done her job. She had held her ground. She had answered when she was asked. The bell above the door rang. A man and a woman came in, somewhere in their 60s, road-worn and tired, and looking at the menu board with the focused consideration of people who have been driving a long time and are deciding whether they're hungry enough for a full meal or just coffee and pie. Emily picked up her notepad. She walked across the diner. "Evening," she said, "and welcome to Russ Creek. Can I start you off with something to drink?" The woman looked up. She had kind eyes, the kind that registered you as a person immediately without having to decide to. She smiled. "Coffee would be wonderful," she said. "Thank you, honey." Emily wrote it down. She went and got the coffee. She brought it back. She kept going. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and Emily Carter, who had worked every night and pressed her uniform every morning, and kept her brother's name written on a white envelope in a kitchen drawer, and had answered when she was asked, already knew it.